Great, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Melanie Bressler, the U.S. Program Director of the Transatlantic think tank Commonwealth. Commonwealth works on economic democratization, decommodification, and decarbonization, often through the framework of building the green mix ownership economy. We're excited to convene these two panels today in partnership with the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins during this most timely occasion of the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in DC to consider global power, decarbonization, and development. Following the UNFCCC conference of the parties COP26 in 2021, climate politics scholar Alyssa Battistoni wrote, "Since the first was held in Berlin in 1995, when atmospheric carbon levels were around 358 parts per million, today they hover around 414. A steady procession of COPs have produced a great deal of geopolitical drama, but have not yet managed to reduce carbon emissions. Our focus today is that a central driver of this failure is the necessity to restructure global economic systems to build the economic capacity for all countries to undertake the transition." I'm personally really excited to bring these panelists together. We will have as moderator Jeremy Wallace, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And then speaking today will be Bentley Allen, Associate Professor of Political Science and Co-Director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins. My colleague Adam Kahn, who is Principal Analyst at Commonwealth, where he focuses on energy in transatlantic and international contexts. He has a background in UK civil service working on these topics. And then Isabel Estevez, who is the Co-Executive Director of the industrial policy think tank I3T and a leading expert on global industrial policy and economic transformation. And so with that, I'll hand over to our moderator.
Great, thanks so much. So when I teach climate politics to undergrads in the past, I usually begin with environmental questions. The idea that we are already facing the problems of climate change today, not just as a problem for the future, and that we need to think about this and be green in an environmental sense. And then I usually switch and transition to talking about the green possibilities in terms of money, a different green, when we think about an energy transition and the billions or trillions of dollars of investment that this will mean and that this will undertake in order to decarbonize the world. And I think in Washington, what appeals to 19-year-olds kind of sometimes works at the level of discourse, unfortunately, for better or worse. I don't even really need to mention like a former John Kerry staffer talking about that US losing its oil and gas leadership is kind of more important than climate change. So I think that there's a question that I'm excited to hear from the kind of participants in this panel is how we can move beyond base interests and base understandings that kind of worry about getting that money in our pockets rather than someone else's, how we can think about kind of a globally cooperative industrial policy. And so with that kind of short introduction, I'll just turn it over to our three speakers. We'll go in the order that Melanie described, so starting with Bentley, and then Adam, and then Isabel. And so just open that, and then once after kind of each of you have some remarks, we'll open it up for discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think what I want to start with is an overall argument for why the G7 countries, in particular the United States, but also all of the countries that are really in charge of the World Bank and the IMF, which are meeting this week, why these countries should actually try to build manufacturing and value added in developing countries. And then I think that will answer your question in a kind of oblique way, but will allow and prepare for maybe a more direct answer to your question. So why should countries in the global north advocate and create manufacturing and processing value added in the global south? The first reason is just that we need everybody to participate. We need so much investment. We need trillions of dollars of investment over the coming years that we need everybody to actually take part in this effort. The United States, if the IRA and its bottomless mimosas mobilizes as much money as the largest private estimates suggest, will mobilize about $1 trillion. That's about 25% of the $4 trillion that the IEA says is needed in capital expenditure for the main supply chains. So that's about the US doing its share. It's not doing more than its share. It's not doing less than its share. It's doing about its share of investment if the IRA is successful. And we need every country to basically take up the same mantle, right? To say, actually, what is our percentage of GDP? Well, we need to actually invest our percentage of global GDP in these supply chains. And so far, no country is doing more than they need to in that regard. And so we actually just need everybody to participate in this. And also, there are lots of niches that these different countries have, different abilities and capabilities that they can bring to bear on building global value chains. And we need all of those countries to develop their expertise in their niches so that we can all benefit from the technological innovation and the positive spillovers that technological innovation can create. Getting a little more deeply, we need all of these countries to participate in global green industrial policy precisely because we want those countries to be environmental in the long run, right? We've just come through this 40-year period where we tried to build a global climate cooperation apparatus on top of the idea that we would have some kind of global carbon budget and everybody would be controlled or slotted into a global carbon pricing system. And that was revealed to be a failure, certainly as early as Copenhagen, but definitely by Paris, which is kind of ironic because Paris is seen as a success story. But it is the end of the idea that we were going to build a global carbon market, and instead a reversion to the idea that we're going to need some kind of other dynamic, whether it's the ratchet that is contained within the Paris Agreement or some other idea to serve as the organizing principle for global climate action. And I would argue that green industrial policy is the organizing principle that is now available to us. And we need countries to actually participate in green industrial policy, because what that does is it creates the coalitions, which then create a positive incentive in each country to actually decarbonize. So what we see in Canada, which is one of the countries I'm most familiar with the political economy, is that now the car makers have seen that as their interests are one with decarbonization, and they are lobbying for policies, which are not my favorite policies per se, but they are policies that will lead to deeper decarbonization in Canada. And that's what you need, is basically all countries to basically participate in green industrial policy so that they build up the interests that are actually equal with decarbonization, because we're not going to do it through some kind of top-down global mechanism like we thought for a really long time, right? So we need everybody to participate. We need everybody to build green coalitions because that's what decarbonization demands. We need that investment and we need those interest formations in order to actually decarbonize the planet. But there's all kinds of other reasons, principally development. There are, as Stiglitz and Roderick have said recently, there are no cases of liberalized ideal development in the most naive of neoliberal development models. Instead, what we need are countries to engage in green industrial policy as a route to the structural transformation of their economies more broadly. And that will, if done right, build the capacity of those states to reduce inequality domestically and produce positive outcomes for their populations. And so it's a good thing that they are able to participate in green industrial policy. And one thing that the World Bank and the IMF need to do is create as much policy space and as much fiscal space for countries to participate in this effort as possible. And I think that's closely related to another core reason why countries should actually support green industrial policy in the global south, which is that it actually increases the autonomy and democratic potential of those countries, right? If those countries are able to generate export dollars in order to develop, then that will make them less dependent on the World Bank, and that will allow them more space to pursue their own individual policies, which then their publics can debate about and have a proper democratic discussion about, instead of dealing with IMF dictates, right? One of the supreme ironies of the last couple of months here in Washington is that in the basement of this room, of this building, President Ruto gave a speech in which he and Podesta, who was also in the room, talked about how the US and Kenya were going to cooperate on green industrial policy. And then as soon as Ruto went home, he faced protests from his own public because the IMF had imposed such strong austerity on the Kenyan government that they would be unable to actually implement the green industrial policy agreements that they had just forged with the United States, right? So Kenya lacked both the fiscal space and the autonomy to actually implement what everybody, I think, agreed here in DC was the right path forward for Kenya, right? So we actually need to change the global economic order to give countries that space to have that democratic conversation, to make the state worth fighting over. Under neoliberalism, if the state is just middle management between global capital and people, then it's not worth having a democracy about. And the backlash that we've seen regarding that is part of the reason why we're seeing the rise of populism all over the world. And so I think just from a purely self-interested manner, countries in the global north should see that they need the participation of countries in the global south in manufacturing and value-added processing for the net zero transition. But there are also these other positive effects that would come from supporting that. So we are often, I think, in this era of thinking about green industrial policy as a purely nationalist effort, right? And I just think that's an untenable position. We have to see that nationalism within an international lens, and we have to figure out a way to make the political economy of nationalism, which supports industrial policy and which the benefits of industrial policy can deliver for a nation, for a people, have to be situated within a broader international order that makes space for that and which encourages that.
Thanks, Ben.
Cool. Well, thank you, and yeah, really great to be here. So yeah, I'm just say a little bit about myself. I'm Adam Khan. As Melanie said, I work at Commonwealth on our kind of like energy aspect, and just flown over from London yesterday. So really excited to be here. Yeah, so I think the title of the panel was sort of principles of green industrial strategies globally, and I guess I want to focus on maybe like 3 key principles that maybe more like a kind of theoretical level, because I think others on the panel are probably like better placed to go into some of the specifics. So the 3 principles I wanted to kind of touch on are, first is on this question of coordination as a particular mode of cooperation, and like kind of thinking what coordination can really mean. Then I want to talk about risk and uncertainty and kind of like unpacking that. And then finally, ownership. So Commonwealth's big theme is kind of the politics and economy of ownership. So I have to touch on that. Start on coordination, and topic that my colleague Melanie has written and spoken a lot about. I really think we can kind of rethink coordination in quite an interesting way. So we often talk about the kind of the distinction between kind of market-based modes of coordination and kind of non-market, public or social modes of coordination. I think we also need to think about kind of like the dimensions along which, in a green transition context, that kind of coordination might occur. So I guess the 2 like most obvious ones are like kind of space and time. So we can think about coordinating what's fundamentally an investment, kind of fixed capital investment program for these green transitions across time. As Melanie mentioned, I used to work in the UK government principally on electricity, and a big challenge we had was kind of linking up the rollout of grid infrastructure with the rollout of renewables and all the kind of challenges that's posed. And then that also brings us onto a kind of a spatial mode of coordination, where you build assets, but also in a global context, obviously the spatial or geographic dimension becomes increasingly important. But I also think there's another dimension that's maybe slightly less tangible, but is kind of coordination within a society across different interest groups, or coordination between sort of different actors, but in a kind of like socially cohesive way, which I think is often the challenge. When you see this as been mentioned, kind of the backlash against these programs is often, I think, from kind of position of sort of like discoordination or really like dysfunction. And recently I've been really interested in this idea of kind of rethinking the idea of efficiency in that kind of like system context. So there's some authors who talk about an infrastructure as needing kind of system efficiency. I think there's different nodes of a network. How you operate those and in what order is really the kind of what's most critical, and it's not so much a question of allocation or allocative efficiency all the time. I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. Let's move on to risk, and this kind of follows on, I think, quite neatly. So the kind of classic definition of risk is from Frank Knight, where he talked about this being kind of quantifiable uncertainty. But recently I've been reading some kind of papers that really like go to the origin of that and kind of think about what that really means. And they talk about kind of the quantification that Knight was talking about is really a social quantification. It's not something that's kind of like inherent in the universe about, you know, what can we quantify and what can we not. It's really about, can we socially cohere an understanding of what the future might look like, and how can we put numbers on that. And the example he kind of points to, and obviously is probably the most important, is finance as a mode of that social quantification. And I think if you think about risk in that way with a kind of social lens, the concept of de-risking, which is obviously key to a lot of these debates, becomes like kind of more interesting. And to the extent that de-risking is problematic, which I think a lot of people say so, I think it's because the mode of quantification, the mode of fixing the future, to use that term, is embedded in all the kind of extractive and damaging social forms of social systems that we have, and particularly in a global context. And obviously, kind of like historically, that's also been the case. So I think that's just an interesting question to think about, like, what would a better society, a better social form of quantification look like? I think it wouldn't just be the kind of, we need billions of dollars, we need trillions of dollars, we need capital of this amount, etc. I think it would be a much like deeper like understanding really of like real economy forms of the transition, but also like a form of fixing the future that can actually like allow for a new future and not just continuing the present. And finally, ownership. As I said, this is kind of the central defining concept of Commonwealth. And I think it's like probably differs in some important ways between kind of developed and developing countries, particularly in the question of state ownership. And I think this kind of points to what you're talking about kind of this making democracy something worth fighting over, or the state worth fighting over. And they kind of like general like move away, particularly in the West, from forms of public ownership, particularly in energy, as being like really damaging, but in quite like interesting ways. And I think it's not just a case of public good, private bad, but really you have to look at how do different ownership models engender different forms of, as I said, coordination or kind of different ways of looking at risk. And in the UK, kind of a lot of my work at the moment is thinking through what ownership, particularly electricity, could look like. We have new institutions that the new government is setting up. And I think it's an exciting kind of pathway through to kind of move away from kind of rigid models. I think its application in other countries might be interesting. A lot of countries have significant state-owned enterprises in the energy sector. It's not the case in the UK, but I realise that it's not always the case that in other countries that these are the most progressive institutions. So I think there's like kind of an interesting question there about when you're kind of starting from scratch, what can you achieve, and then what would the implications be more generally? So yeah, I think that's probably like broadly where I'd conclude for now.
That's great.
Thank you. And I'm going to talk a little bit longer than my colleagues, but I think hopefully it's okay. So also, first of all, really a big thanks to the conveners for creating this space to talk about the principles of green industrial policy. There are very few discussions about this, and I think it's a really fundamental issue for those of us in the field. And I think also a lot of us have proposed principles in all kinds of different ways for different specific cases of industrial policy. I have a paper, shameless plug, coming out in a couple of weeks that tries to synthesize and to give kind of an overview of some of those principles. But the thing about principles is also that they tend to emerge kind of as a byproduct of our collective diagnoses of what's going wrong, what we're doing wrong. They're kind of rules that emerge to help us do better than we're currently doing. So what I thought would be helpful here is to also zone in on some of the major concrete problems that I think we're seeing in concrete industrial policies, and to use that problem analysis as fodder for a more collective discussion about what principles are useful and what makes industrial policy good industrial policy. And also just to clarify concepts, I think it's also worth talking about what we mean by industrial policy and green industrial policy. And I think what we mean is that what we mean by industrial policy is efforts to change the way that societies produce and deliver value. So the way that we provide useful things, the way that we make useful things that satisfy human needs. And those processes of value creation and distribution are, in fact, as the panel framed, inherently global. And as we all know, we have an extremely globalized system of production and provisioning. And so industrial policy is basically about reshaping those systems. And green industrial policies more specifically are ones where the effort to transform production and provisioning systems factor in and try to solve for environmental challenges. So that's it at a very abstract general level. And then in terms of the toolkit for industrial policy, there's a very broad set of tools that includes everything from public procurement, procurement clubs, production clubs, performance standards, intellectual property rights, technology transfer. So pretty much any tool can be an industrial policy tool if it's used for the purpose of changing production systems. And there are many, many rich lessons from concrete historical experiences that can help us think about what tools can be best used in different contexts. So that's the industrial policy toolkit in general and a rough definition of industrial policy. And with that as a backdrop, I think we can move on to trying to distinguish a bit between what green industrial policies are looking like in practice and what they could or should be looking like from a more normative principle standpoint. So I'd like to zone in on 4 problems that I see in this space that many of us have pointed out. So this is just a synthesis of many critiques. And all of these problems, I think, have to do with a certain narrowness or reductive thinking or lack of holism in the way that green industrial strategies are being designed at the moment. The first problem has to do with the narrow way in which industrial policies are defining the relevant industries and the technologies that they're targeting. So most of these policies are geared at ramping up production of renewable energy products or renewable energy infrastructure and their inputs and value chains, and often as part of an export promotion strategy and not much else. So they're very centered on the energy sector and on energy intensive industries like transportation and heavy industry. But they haven't really tackled significantly sectors like food and agriculture, which also face massive environmental challenges around land use and pollution, And they have not factored in the care sector or the services sector, where there are huge opportunities for expanding environmentally friendly productive activities. The second problem is that these policies are also very narrow in terms of the range of environmental parameters that they're trying to solve for. So they're mostly focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but they don't really engage with other pressing environmental challenges like biodiversity loss, or water and land pollution, or even toxic air pollution. So we have all these policies that are aimed at developing new industries or transforming existing industries, but only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a problem because it risks creating new technological path dependencies that may solve for greenhouse gas emissions, but don't solve for other environmental challenges, or even exacerbate other challenges like biodiversity loss, which many people have noted is just as pressing a challenge as climate change. The third problem is that I think today's green industrial policies are not great at factoring in the intersections and the systemic relationships between green objectives and non-green objectives. So many of us have made the point that if green industrial policies are to have pro-developmental or pro-well-being outcomes, they need to be designed in a way that tries to multi-solve, so to create efficiencies and synergies that address several missions at once. So they should also be designed to make industries, in addition to making industries greener, they also have to improve the equity and create quality jobs and bolster macroeconomic resilience, et cetera. And then if they're designed with a broader range of objectives in mind, if they're not designed with those broader objectives in mind, they can end up even undermining the core objective of green transformation. For example, as we're seeing in some countries, by weakening the political alliances that support green industrial policies. And that can happen very easily if the economic benefits of the policies are not realized and not felt. And finally, the fourth problem I want to highlight is that we're often, in designing these policies, failing to see our production system as an inherently global production system. So we're replicating dynamics where industrial capabilities are concentrated in a very small set of oligopolies, and where the global south is being relegated once again to the role of exporting cheap commodities and providing cheap labor, while being a mere market for the exports of expensive products and services from oligopolies and industrialized countries. And that concentration, as Bentley has also suggested, it's not just unfair for the global south, it's bad for all of us. And that's because it perpetuates concentrations of economic power in oligopolies that abuse all of us, and also makes our whole global production system more vulnerable to shocks and less resilient, because there are just fewer productive capabilities to pick up the slack when there's a crisis. So I think all of these critiques very naturally lead to a much more holistic and normative definition of green industrial policy than we've seen in concrete policy experiences. And the way that I try to capture that sometimes is by saying that it should be normatively. Green industrial policy should be about transforming our production systems to fulfill human needs more fully and more equitably, and both at the national and global level, working within ecosystem boundaries. So that means that for all industrial policy, whether it sees itself as green or not, that's the challenge. How do we change the way that we produce and provide useful things to do it more equitably and in a way that's more consistent with long-term livability of the planet? And of course, that includes things like producing more solar panels and wind turbines and cleaner steel and aluminum, but it's also a lot more than that. It entails making sure that global supply chains and production networks for those products are also minimizing environmental impact and upholding high labor standards. It entails building global value chains that produce and distribute value more equitably, or put differently, building global production systems that are more resilient because industrial productive capabilities are no longer concentrated in just a few countries. It also entails demand reduction for some products. Industrial policy is about what we produce more of, but also what we produce less of. And it entails thinking about how industrial policy can be designed to create good jobs, to create linkages, to manage inflation, to ensure food security, to reduce poverty. So basically, to make sure that industrial policy is serving a broader set of more holistic societal challenges, or at least ensuring that it's not actively undermining those objectives. And I'm sorry, I'll take a couple of more minutes to also give a concrete example, because I think even though when we're talking about principles, we may be, I think, tempted to think that principled industrial policy is hard to do, and therefore that's why we're not doing it. I think the good news is that it's actually not that hard to do, just a little bit of creativity. I mean, as we've said earlier, there's a huge range of tools that can be used for green industrial strategy, and there are very creative ways to deploy them. And I want to give an example of a case study of just how one of these tools, specifically procurement policy, has been used in one developing country to do a lot of the things that I've just named. And just for context, for those of you that may not be familiar with procurement policy, it is probably the most widely used industrial policy in the world. So one of the best known examples is probably Buy American policy in the US that establishes minimum levels of domestic content for certain kinds of government purchases of things like concrete and steel. But these kinds of procurement policies are also very widely used also in Europe, many other places. And the US is also experimenting with the use of procurement policies for green transformation through a framework called Buy Clean. That's about low carbon procurement for some of those sectors. But in the interest of branching out from the US context, I want to use an example from a developing country, from Ecuador, and how they used procurement about a decade ago. So like many developing countries, Ecuador is a commodity dependent country. About 50% of its exports are oil exports, and much of the rest is bananas, flowers, and shrimp. So it's a typical case of a productive structure that really desperately needs diversification to develop more high value added sectors and to capture more value and to build economic resilience. So 10 years ago or so, Ecuador took a cue from the kinds of procurement policies that the US and Europe use and tried to and succeeded in creating a procurement system that did a few things. First, it gave very slight preferences across every product category in the procurement market to both foreign and domestic suppliers that were willing to incorporate some level of domestic content in their products and services. Second, it gave higher preferences in some strategic sectors to companies that were willing to do some level of technology transfer. So everything from training workers to do maintenance of sophisticated capital goods to investing in local companies to develop new productive capabilities. And also, it gave preferences in some sectors to small and micro enterprises and associative and cooperative enterprises to diversify the base of suppliers and to decrease market concentrations. And they also implemented something like a Buy Clean policy that required all government vehicles to be electric vehicles and gave preferences to suppliers that had environmental impact certificates. And what those policies did in just a couple of years had some pretty interesting results. First of all, there was a displacement of imports in favor of new domestic production. So some moves toward development of new industries and a macroeconomic impact of more than 1% of GDP as a result of reduction of imports with just this one policy instrument. It also made the procurement market much less concentrated and much more competitive. So before the policy, there were only 32 suppliers that accounted for 50% of government purchases. And within 2 years of implementation, there was no single supplier that held more than 1.3% of the procurement market. So it brought in a host of new economic actors into the procurement market that had been previously sidelined by those oligopolistic dynamics that were previously in place. And finally, it directly reduced the demand for combustion vehicles and increased the demand for EVs. So it started to make moves toward green transformation. And that was, like I said, more than a decade ago. So that's an example of how just one industrial policy tool, the tool of public procurement, can be used to tackle multiple economic, social, and environmental problems at once, which I think is a useful reference point to think about how to design not just good industrial policy, but good green industrial policy. And I'll just say that the main takeaway from all of this that I really want to convey is that every industrial policy is also an environmental policy and a distributional policy and a natural resources policy, a labor policy, and a macro policy. So all of these things are interconnected. And as we try to reshape production systems and make them greener, we also have to think about how to green production in a way that's coherent and intertwined with other developmental objectives. And from a South-North standpoint, I think one of the most important things we can do here in the global North is just to apply a do no harm principle. So to allow these industrial policies in the global South to flourish, as Bentley has said, so that we can move toward a more equitable global production system, instead of doing what we've done historically, which to be honest is frankly to undermine industrial policies in the global South by using unfair trade and investment rules and institutions that kick away the development ladder, as Ha-Joon Chang puts it. I'll leave it there for now, and thank you.
That's great. So there's a lot of things that, a lot of points of overlap and a lot of points of discussion. But maybe as an entree into this discussion, I'll present a devil's advocate position. So this is a conversation that is explicitly about industrial policy, green industrial policy, which sometimes could be contrasted with, although obviously overlaps in some ways, with decarbonization policy, right? That these are not like, so as someone like me who has studied China and China's political economy for a long time, a lot of the discussion that is happening now is the rest of the world talking about China as having overcapacity in some of these sectors, including in sectors where we're talking about that look green, right, that are about part of the clean renewable future, like solar panels in particular, but also EVs and others. So why, and I think all of you have answers to this question, but I do want to kind of like try to be as explicit as possible about what those answers are. Why is it important that we focus on green industrial policy and global green industrial policy rather than a global decarbonization policy? Does that make sense as a kind of a big picture theoretical question to start? and whoever wants to take that, because it seemed like each of you have kind of pieces of answers or ideas that connect with that. It's probably most natural for Bentley, given your project.
Yeah, I think that we don't get to global decarbonization without green industrial policy. So I think of the green industrial policy as being a necessary condition of deep decarbonization, which is to say that all other climate policies will be politically fragile. And so the only politically sustainable policy is one that actually delivers economic benefits that are broad-based. And so for me, these things go hand in hand. And in the literature that this insight comes from in political science, the argument is basically that the sequencing of climate policies has been gotten backwards basically all over the world, where we try to create a stringent pricing framework or regulatory policy first, and then do green industrial policy. Well, what you do then is you basically make everybody upset with climate policy, and then you get around to trying to realize the benefits. Whereas if you did things the other way around, you do industrial policy first, then you're building lots of support for decarbonization amongst voters and firms, and then you can actually do more stringent regulatory or pricing policies because you've created a constituency that's going to benefit from those policies, thereby reducing the political backlash that you're likely to succumb to. And the other critical mechanism here is the reduction in the price of technologies, right? The reason why we got lots of climate action after Copenhagen was not because Copenhagen was a success, but because China started to massively scale the solar and wind supply chains at that exact same time. So by the time we got to Paris, it was starting to become clear that solar was going to be cheaper than coal everywhere in the world pretty soon. And not thanks to any of the international agreements or any of the moralizing of global north countries, but because China had engaged in green industrial policy that scales those supply chains beyond our imagination. And so I think that there just isn't a world in which we decarbonize without green industrial policy. So for me, I want to have the conversation about decarbonization. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. But you actually have to put green industrial policy and the difficulties and the concessions and the compromises that green industrial policy entails. You actually have to put that first if you hope to get decarbonization that is stable in the long run.
Yeah, happy to go next. I think it's probably a fairly straightforward kind of like political answer to your question, which is you probably can't achieve, at least in kind of normally democratic societies, you know, the decarbonization that we need, and particularly I'd say like at the speed that we need, without the kind of narrative around jobs, reindustrialization, and a clear like a nationalist or sort of tending towards that argument. I do wonder a bit about that. I mean, the US, it seems to be, has engaged in a very ambitious, under this administration, very ambitious green industrial policy, and it doesn't seem to be getting many political dividends, at least in how close the election is. So I mean, I say that just as something from outside, but I think that's probably like, has some truth also in Europe as well, probably in other countries. They're like actually getting the political benefits you think you're going to get from this is actually quite hard. But it's aside from the politics, there's maybe like a more interesting, or maybe not more interesting, but kind of say more sophisticated, like functional argument here, which is that I think that, I mean, I'll maybe explain this just like with an example. So I used to work in a team in the UK government that looks at the kind of carbon budgets, which are the kind of like 5-year increments by which we get to the 2050 net zero target. And in particular, I was part of a team that looks at kind of the role of carbon removal as part of that. Greenhouse gas removal is the term we use, but in this work, of course, carbon dioxide removal. And we kind of get advice from an independent group called the Climate Change Committee, which is kind of like in statute. And they have these like very kind of complex modeling techniques about, what's the pathway across sectors, and then what's the residual emission and what year, and then, okay, we'll abate that, or we won't abate that, we'll just rely on removals. And you kind of get this very interesting, like very well, I'd say, modeled and complex advice. And then you're sat there in a government department, like 100 stakeholders all from these companies, and you're like, okay, how do we actually implement this? And kind of ironically, a lot of these models are like optimization models, which is clearly like at odds with the kind of the economics that we live in. So I think that's where the kind of industrial policy angle comes in. You're dealing with real firms in the real economy and real workers and their representatives. And like you just think mechanics of achieving a lot of these things, it becomes quite complex. For example, should the aviation sector be kind of ramping down, or should it just be allowed to buy offset emissions? Those are kind of, you can model that question, but I think really is fundamentally an industrial policy question. So I just think you feel on a number of angles, you just won't get decarbonization really at the speed we need for that industrial policy.
I guess I just have one more tangential comment to add to that, on your point about the political dividends of green industrial policy, which I definitely agree with what both of you have said about the need to have a decarbonization process that's sustainable. You need to deliver economic benefits. In the case of the US, I think the reason that we're not getting the political dividends from industrial policy is in large part because we have not been successful in implementing industrial policy that upholds some of the principles that I laid out earlier. So namely, labor standards. As many of you probably know, there was a long period during which the United Auto Workers held out on endorsing Biden for the presidency, and some unions have not supported Harris in this election. And the reason that the United Auto Workers explicitly gave for withholding their endorsement of Biden was that they were not, the policies that were being implemented by the administration were not including labor standards for EV production. So the master agreements of the UAW did not apply to EV production. And that creates discontent, that creates, in addition to creating discontent, it just like very concretely does not deliver economic benefits. And like I said, undermines a coalition that's capable of sustaining industrial policy. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
No, I mean, I think that,
I just wanted to respond to the argument that the US is so far not able to see the coalition effects. I think we can see the coalition effects. I mean, first of all, coalition building takes a long time, but this summer, a New York representative, Garbino, wrote a letter to Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, saying, look, here's 18 Republicans who are not going to vote for an IRA repeal. And so you can actually see tangible evidence that the coalition building efforts of the IRA are actually already operating, not to the degree that we want them to, and it's going to take a long time to hold that coalition together if we actually manage to hold that coalition together, but it is working as designed, right? The IRA was explicitly designed by some very smart people to actually have this teeth in it, right? That it would deliver economic goods to Republican districts, and that therefore it would be very difficult for them to repeal. So some of the largest battery factories are in Republican districts. Andy Biggs, who is in the Freedom Caucus, has the third largest battery factory in the country in his district. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that Andy Biggs would vote for an IRA repeal that is going to kill thousands of jobs in his district, right? That's not a foregone conclusion. To me, that's an open question. And that's the power of the IRA, is that it has these teeth kind of built into it that make it actually difficult to rip out of American political economy. And if there's one thing that American political economy has, it's a lot of veto points. And so it's actually very difficult to change something that has been created. So time will tell whether or not the thesis of the designers of the IRA is true, that it will be difficult to repeal. But Republicans talked a big game before the Affordable Care Act, and they couldn't come up with the votes. And that was an important lesson, I think, to the framers of the IRA. And I do think that the coalition is there, and we will see what happens. We will get a good front row seat to this in the next month. So we don't have to wait long.
I mean, I think there's definitely something to be said that the political coalition argument about building a sustainable politics of decarbonization makes a lot of sense. But I do think that the extent to which we are questioning this in the domestic case of one particular state that is on a very generous set of policies is at some level an easy test, right? That what we're talking about when we're talking about a global industrial policy seems like a much harder political kind of hurdle to jump. And so I guess if there are questions about individual states and individual states' actions and the ways in which they will actually redound to the benefits of those who are interested in kind of pursuing green industrial policy or decarbonization as a kind of a goal, do we have a sense in which this will actually be able to coordinate or kind of work across borders, and that those political difficulties, because you can imagine it's difficult to incentivize Alabamans to kind of put up solar panels or kind of build batteries, that you have to convince someone to pay for that. Are we going to be able to convince those in the United States to help people in Albania to do the same? it seems to me that that's an even harder political task. And so I guess the funding mechanisms for a global industrial policy is a question. I don't know if this is maybe separate than the ownership question, but I think it probably leads into that direction as well. So where does the money for a global green industrial policy come from?
Well, I guess we do have a panel that's hopefully going to
Yeah,
address many of that.
I think something about the green. We will.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, one of the hard realities is that we don't have enough green certainly in the global south to implement many of these policies. And what you see even in places in large countries with a lot of power like Brazil is that they are fiscally incredibly constrained and not embracing policies that are going to expand fiscal space for green industrial policy. So even though there's a lot of planning and great ideas for how to do it, it's maybe not happening in the way that people would want it to happen. I mean, many things can be said about this. I'm sure will be addressed extensively in a few moments. But one thing that I often like to bring up, because I think it undermines many arguments about the lack of fiscal space, is that things like government procurement that I talked about extensively is basically about repurposing dollars that are being spent, or not dollars, whatever, money that's already being spent, green that's already being spent anyway, and just repurposing it to use it as a green industrial strategy, a green industrial policy mechanism. So I think finding those kinds of efficiencies where you're already spending money, you can just spend it a little bit differently, and for a small marginal additional cost, you can have massive industrial transformation. I think that's one of the main challenges for policymakers, to find creative solutions that do exactly this kind of, find these kinds of synergies and efficiencies that can be built into the existing public investment system.
Maybe I have one thing. I've been interested in this idea recently of carbon drawdown obligation, or carbon take back obligation, people say, on basically fossil fuel companies and extractors, for like historical as well as current emissions. So this is distinct from a kind of like offset concept, and it would be like an enforcement, but again, like much stronger than existing emissions trading schemes. So I think that's an interesting one. I think it's particularly when you're trying to direct into, say, carbon removal, where there's a clear link ton by ton. I do think that's an exciting, interesting area. Implementing that at a global scale would be an immense undertaking, particularly when you've got kind of state fossil fuel producers. But I do think there's some interesting things to think about there. But just on the ownership link, I do think there's something interesting here, which is that some context that I've looked at, like, privatized systems just like bleed out money. So you're going to be constantly putting more capital into these things, but in the way in which it happens, you're not getting the most value for what you could be doing there in terms of the concrete, like real economy, real environmental gains you're trying to get. So I do think there's something interesting there as well.
I think you could imagine that so Bentley mentioned that the US IRA, like the estimates go into the over $1 trillion, right? About the amount of spending in this space. But that is using a private multiplier to public spending, right? Public dollars are going to also crowd in private dollars. And I guess I just wonder about the extent to which we can rely on those private dollars, or the extent to which we can kind of like have coordination and ownership, the ways in which we're going to navigate this reliably in order to build coalitions to be system efficient, right? But at the same time, so I guess to me it seems like there are likely two different visions of the way this is going to operate, either more kind of planned, organized, state-led, state-owned perhaps even, versus more incentivized but private-led with efficiencies driven by kind of like production chains and capitalist pressures. I don't know, maybe there isn't actually that difference in this panel as much as I imagined there might be. But to me, there are two wolves on my shoulders, and they both kind of talk. And so I wonder if you also have these discussions and debates.
Is it for me? Oh,
yeah.
Well, I think Commonwealth would clearly favour one of those positions. I think that there are some kind of grey areas there. And actually, like, I'm struck by conversations I had with the private sector entities, particularly saying carbon removal, like, actually they kind of like the sort of state plan version, and some of the kind of positions they would advocate kind of like tend towards that, but obviously with the carve out for their particular It's maybe not surprising because they're trying to win out over their competitors as much as trying
Yeah.
to game out with the government. But I do think there's like potentially a kind of a compromise through this in some context. I do think like in certain sectors, the kind of like market-driven efficiencies just do not occur. So I see this in electricity. It's like quite an obvious one, which is why basically, with a few exceptions, every kind of country that's rapidly decarbonizing power has very intensive state kind of planning capacities. And I see it's like an inevitable requirement. And I think as we build out new industries like carbon capture, removals, probably some forms of industrial industrial sectors, you end up with the same kinds of patterns, and you'll end up needing to tend towards one of the other to get, I'd say, particularly the speed at which we need. Because I think a lot of times these kind of market-driven efficiencies are happening in a very kind of like haphazard back and forth way. And so
I mean, I think investment, no matter who it's by, should increase productivity. I don't think that firms have a monopoly on identifying opportunities to increase productivity. And in fact, I can think of lots of like Brett Christopher kind of examples where the internal rate of return on a private assessment of the project finance would not clear the hurdle for an oil company, which is used to a 35% margin, to actually make the investment. But overall, that investment would still improve society. Like, yeah, we should make that investment, right? If it doesn't clear a private rate of return, but it is still a productive investment, then the public should make that investment. If the public doesn't need to make that investment because a private actor wants to make that investment, then I don't have a big problem with that, as long as I think it's in a publicly beneficial area. And I think that the de-risking public-private finance debate has gotten like stuck in an imagination of the 1990s, which is to say that we're not necessarily in a space where the source of the dollars really matters, when what we're trying to assess is the purpose to which those dollars are being put to. So if a government is making it so that a whole area of the economy is now investable, and it was not investable prior. I think of the European Battery Alliance, which actually didn't even put that much public money up front, right? We publicly sort of committed to fund Northvolt, right? And then at the last funding round for Northvolt, Goldman Sachs and VW came in, right? And in the first round, it was basically the EIB and the IKEA Philanthropy Foundation, the family foundation, saying we're going to fund this battery factory. But in the end, Goldman Sachs came in. That to me is not necessarily de-risking, that's market making. That's like what Matsukato talks about, right? That's opening up a whole terrain. And then was there a lot of public money needed for the next 750 gigawatts? Not really, right? Because the European Battery Alliance created a commitment to a sector that drove a lot of investment and a lot of steering. That's a successful case of industrial policy for me. And the exact division of public versus private dollars to that is not that important to me. I'd rather just say, yeah, that one was successful. I'm going to take those public dollars and move them into the next sector where they're most productive. And I just think we're dealing with politics. Politics is the art of the possible. The art of the possible is not necessarily that we come up with some ideal division of how this crowding in is going to work or not work, or whether we call it de-risking or not de-risking. It's really about going into the sectors where investment is most needed, figuring out what's going on there, how all the policies and financial incentives are being aligned in those sectors, and making it work in a productive sense. And sometimes that is going to mean an outsized role for the state in that sector. And in other cases, it's not going to mean that. And in a lot of cases, I might sit in my chair as an analyst and say, this is exactly the way I would like the policy to unfold in this sector. And then what happens is the Canadian government spends $40 billion on zero value add battery factories, and I'm banging my head against the wall. Or the Indian state spends $10 billion on biofuels, and I'm banging my head against the wall. But you know what? At the end of the day, both of those policies are going to lead to more decarbonization than the baseline case in which the government doesn't spend that money. So I don't love that, but those are both robust and strong uses of public money for industrial policies that I'm not loving every dollar of that public dollar. So just because we want a more robust version of the public doesn't mean we get the money to be spent where we want it to be spent, because politics isn't that easy. So I think we have to just like kind of roll with the punches and be flexible in the way that we are assessing and evaluating investments. And then within the landscape in which we find ourselves, we push for the best outcome that we possibly can. But, you just pick up your stuff and move and fight in the next sector once the investments are made.
Yeah, I think the ideal of the price, the kind of price mechanism which we are moving away from in many ways, is to try to kind of, in some ways, the industrial policy kind of building out the new industries is obviously critical, but it is not the only piece, right? There is also the drawdown, the kind of declining, kind of pushing down these other industries, and the price mechanism still seems like one of the principal ways in which this is going to happen. Like obviously, I hope that we have some fusion breakthrough, and so everything kind of becomes extremely cheap, and we have energy abundance without any problems. And maybe solar is moving in that direction already, but I still think there's going to be a lot of kind of need to price things, especially if you move to like food and agriculture or land use or other types of, right? So, and the kind of one example of a price mechanism in the carbon space really working, the extent to which it does anywhere, is in Europe. And Europe now is putting forward, and to get, like, this is coming back circular to the Global South discussion, because the CBAM, right, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is a way that the European Union has tried to deal with the problem of carbon leakage, right? The idea that, well, if local producers have to pay some carbon fee, well, outside producers might be able to kind of undercut them on price. And so the European Union is trying to put forward this kind of mechanism, which makes sense from a decarbonization perspective at some level, but has these real global kind of effects that seem discriminatory against those in the global South. And so I wonder if there can be, if you have reflections on like how we should think about CBAM as, is this a model, or is this like kind of an anti-model or somewhere in between?
And I might circle back to the previous question too
Yeah.
after this, but I guess on the CBAM specifically, first of all, I'd love to hear from our European colleagues what they think about the ETS and CBAM and the effectiveness of the ETS in Europe, because I've heard pretty mixed reviews. And on CBAM, I think certainly it's not a mechanism the way it's currently designed that's taking into account the manifold objections from the global South. And I think there haven't been, to my knowledge, and I'd love to be wrong about this if others have different information, but to my knowledge, there hasn't really been an effort to engage global South voices or representation in the design of these mechanisms, either in Europe or in the US, where we're also debating all kinds of different carbon border adjustment mechanisms at the moment, and there are several bills in Congress under consideration. I think the main problem that I see with CBAM, in addition to potentially anti-developmental impacts, which again, it's a complicated question, the main problem that I see is that it's trying to impose on the rest of the world a single policy framework for dealing with the carbon border adjustment issue. Whereas I think some of the more interesting proposals that we're seeing in the US right now are actually going, instead of imposing or basing the entire mechanism on carbon pricing, they're dealing more, or they're reframing it more in terms of emissions intensity. So the idea there is that no matter what policy pathway you choose, whether it's public investment or anything else, as long as you achieve a certain levels of emissions intensity that's low, if your emissions intensity reaches certain levels, then you shouldn't be outcompeted unfairly by other producers that have higher emissions intensity. So I think having a framework that's more focused on how effective your industry has been in lowering environmental impact makes more sense than a mechanism that's built around the policy instrument, in the case of the CBAM, the carbon pricing mechanism.
I can jump in on this. I mean, and this goes back to the Albanians and Alabamans, like how do we incentivize investment that works globally, or that is kind of for globally. So if the EU led the CBAM discussion by saying, actually, we have this facility that we've created called the EU Global Gateway, which is meant to invest in manufacturing and processing value added and innovation in the global South. And here's like the targeted sectors in which the Global Gateway is going to operate. And we're going to go right now to Indian steel mills and write contracts for difference for green steel coming out of those Indian steel mills. Like if that's the way the conversation started, and then the conversation ended with a CBAM, then you could understand it, right? Because then the CBAM at that point is there to protect an investment in Indian green steel and German green steel against Chinese green steel, right? So you could understand it from within that context. And if you were in the global south, you could be like, yeah, I was brought in a certain way. And there is a clear mechanism which is meant to build the value of the green transition for countries in the global south, to give us a place in these global value chains, and to build an innovation and an industrial economy at the same time. That would be one way of approaching the conversation, right? But instead, as it always is with the EU, right, there's a technocratic analysis of how we're going to work this into our very finely tuned, when I think about perverse forms of quantification, I think of the EU's like really detailed carbon accounting and the incredibly bureaucratic system in which all of the climate policies fit together just so in this way that only a senior bureaucrat could love in the European system. And not to say that hasn't had tremendous value for the world. The EU as a climate leader is not something that we should wish away. We need the EU to be a climate leader, right? But I just think this current era that we're in is calling for a different kind of leadership, not a leadership on making sure that the spreadsheet works, but leadership in terms of catalyzing actual innovation and actual manufacturing and value-added processing elsewhere in the world, and for the CBAM to be a tool that aids that, rather than it's the CBAM first and now we'll try to pay people off so they're not quite so mad at us, and so that we are able to diffuse this argument that we're engaging in green colonialism, right? Yeah, so I could imagine it being a useful tool, but it certainly shouldn't be the thing that we're leading with rather than the thing that we're following.
Yeah, I mean, on the ETS and CBAM, so I think like clearly the EU ETS has had some successes. I think most like obviously in power, but I think there's some nuance there. So I mean, in the UK, there's significant decarbonization of power during the period where the UK was still in the EU, and kind of the carbon price like had a role there, and kind of particularly on gas versus coal, and kind of the driving out coal. But I think there's a kind of layers to that story that aren't always told, which is that actually it was recognised that the carbon price was too low to get that effect. So the government introduced a carbon price floor, which basically mandated a certain level of price and rerouted subsidies throughout the system. And it coupled it with a significant kind of contracts for difference regime, which has all kinds of problems, but is a kind of, it's an exactly non-price mechanism, and that it's fixing prices and essentially destroying in quite complex ways price signals throughout the system. So I think it's a complex story. And I think there's similar situations in other sectors. I think the debate on ETS becomes even more complex when you look forward. So as I said, I was involved in kind of carbon removal, and there's this kind of ambition eventually to have carbon removal in emissions trading schemes. But actually, when you look at where these kind of residual emissions are, all these hard-to-abate sectors, they're generally in sectors which aren't in emissions trading schemes, and where the integration of those schemes into them is politically very challenging and technically challenging as well, particularly on land use and agriculture. So the kind of price mechanism doesn't quite work, and so what you have is basically big tech companies, basically US-based tech companies, buying carbon removal credits with the hope that one day is forms part of a kind of coherent strategy. It's actually not the sectors that need to long-term be doing this. I know less about CBAM, but I think that the points that Isabel's raised are probably right. I just want to come back on one point mentioned earlier around Northvolt. And this is interesting reporting recently on challenges that companies encounter, particularly with competing with the US. So I don't know, with China, maybe also the US. But I think there's nuances there, and actually you might be needed continuation support. And actually, there's an interesting comparison in a UK company called British Volt, which was a kind of an EV battery manufacturer in the northeast of England, which completely failed, partly as a result of just like very hands-off government policy. And the site that they were going to build that factory on is now being purchased by Macquarie, the private equity firm. They're building a big AI data center there, which for me is just like too horrible to even think about. So yeah, I think, and then that's because it partly, as I said, a policy really of hands-off kind of don't want to spend much money on here, don't want to coordinate this transition, let's rely on market forces, and they just failed.
So I've monopolized the discussions and questions, but we do have some audience here, so I should kind of open it up for questions. So if you could introduce yourselves and then kind of ask away.
Hiya, I have. Thank you very much, everybody. I've got a few questions, but can I steal 2 questions? Okay. So my first question is kind of. My name is Katie. I work for the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And I'm coming out of conversations around where the focus is on, how do we get this big target of money? How do we get $1 trillion every year for doing all the things that we want to do? And we don't get to these. I mean, I'm thinking about it in terms of like orders of like the actually where that money goes, how that goes through what, and what it gets spent on, and how. So we're talking about the how here, and I totally take your point, Isabel, around, you know, we need to also find the things that doesn't require more dollar spending. But what that the underpinning sort of logic of a lot of those conversations remains private first. It remains, you know, we don't need coordination around industrial policy. We need coordination around investment platforms, and we're even seeing that, you know, the JETPs that were begun at COP26 have kind of transmorgified into Brazil yesterday launched this Brazilian investment platform around, you know, from what I understood, not again, I haven't read everything about it, but you know, the JETPs, you know, from that were started at COP26 was very much oriented around, you know, we need to, you know, manage this transition. But what it ended up being wasn't an industrial planning process where the developing countries were in the driving seat. It was a sort of, you know, we'll repurpose money we've already committed in different places, and actually nothing has changed and nothing has moved on, and it really scratched the surface. So I suppose my question is like, how do we shift that? That is a really big shift to get from this framework of thinking to what we're talking about today in terms of that, you know, how do we move from coordinating JETPs to coordinating global industrial policy? And then I suppose like my second question, which is not unrelated, is around like countervailing power, because I think, you know, we need to be aware, and I think everybody is the conversation revolves around what's happening in developed countries, because that is where the power within this conversation is. But if that remains the case, what we see is like countries sort of coming like, please, can we have some tech transfer? You know, please, could we get, you know, a few more million for this initiative? You know, could you help us be, you know, lower level assembly production, so that we could maybe have a little piece of the tiny supply chain pie? And that just isn't. Well, that doesn't meet the ambitions or expectations of the South, but it also isn't realistic if we're talking about that realism of the transition that we want globally, right? So how do we get away from those paternalistic dynamics? What are the opportunities for building countervailing power? And connected to that, how do we avoid the scenario where, considering all the power the power is very concentrated, it's not just a me and my pals where self-interest and security and migration, all these things gets repurposed, but actually is somewhat inclusive, if we're not going to get a genuinely inclusive, but somewhat inclusive. So two big questions.
Okay, I think I'll start with the second one because I have clear answers to that one. The first one's really hard, but I think not unrelated to the second one. And I think what we're starting to see more and more of in the global South is countries kind of coming to the realization that kind of waiting around for paternalistically like nice policies from the global North has not been effective. And so we're starting to see a lot more proposals for things like forming production clubs, forming procurement clubs, forming investment clubs among global South countries, precisely to kind of create some kind of, to counterbalance the concentrations of power in global North. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, just from a strictly pragmatic perspective. Because, I mean, not only are all these productive capabilities currently concentrated in global North, but you also have global North countries organizing new production clubs amongst themselves right now, and creating monopsony power by creating buyers clubs, et cetera. So global North is already at a huge advantage, and it's creating more and more cooperative industrial policy structures. And so I think the only choice for global South in that context is to create those same kinds of mechanisms to aggregate power in a way that tries to counterbalance what's happening in global North. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think when it comes to your first question about how to shift to from I guess like the JETP approach to, I guess you're really asking about like how to create industrial policies that make sense, or like how to implement industrial policies instead of just trying to implement investment plans of some sort, right? And I think in that sense, there are interesting lessons to be gleaned from the experience that we have had in the U.S. recently with passing something like the Inflation Reduction Act for all of its flaws. I think here we had an interesting process of engaging different actors within civil society in the process of developing the policy. So the idea was to develop policy and power at the same time. So to build coalitions by trying to influence the shape of the this massive green investment that eventually turned into the IRA. So I think the answer to your question basically just comes down to like how much people in specific contexts, in specific countries and localities, are able to create the same kind of organizing capacity to take the lead in defining like what are the key investments for our country, how can we help shape the nature of those investments, and then making sure that the execution of those investments is also, has accountability and is responsive to the kinds of principles and priorities that are relevant for each locality. And we have not been terribly successful in doing that here, but I think we were partially successful, and it basically just comes down to how well civil society actors are able to organize to shape the nature of these policies. I think that's the best I can do.
Either.
Not sure. I mean, maybe one thing which is my sense is that if we want that kind of attitude in the global south, probably would be better if global north countries were not so arrogant in how they present their own industrial policies. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the way the US presents the IRA in very stark, like nationalistic terms. I think that can't be helpful to countries around the world and how that's perceived, and probably also true of Europe as well. So yeah, I guess a kind of a repivot, would probably help. And I would point again, as cliche to me, but the ownership question probably is quite key. And I think, I don't know the answer to this question, but like understanding what would a social form of coordination and ownership look like in countries where state capacity is weak and corruption is high, and what's the answer to that question of getting that public-private balance, and what is the public in that context? Like, this would have to be key as well.
Yeah, I mean, my faith comes, I think, from what Isabel closed on, which is that that the developing countries themselves want to do this. They want their own green industrial policy, right? And I don't think that they're asking for permission, right? I mean, Lula and Claudia Sheinbaum and others, ran on the promise that they were going to develop green industrial policies that would actually capture value from the energy transition. And so obviously this has some political purchase in those countries and in other countries throughout the world. And I think we're going to see increasingly that effective policymakers are able to figure out within the context in which they find themselves how to make that political argument. And the key, I think, is going to be making sure that those industrial policies are smart and effective. And I think getting back to the theme of the panel, maybe that the principles of how we conduct that industrial policy, I think, is really important. So when I think back to like Alice Amsden, who was writing in 1989, and you mentioned earlier the importance of prices, she's writing this polemic against the idea that development happens because countries got the prices right, because this was the prevailing view of how Korea and Taiwan and other countries in East Asia developed, using, maybe a little state interventionism, but they got the prices right. And she's like, no, actually, Korea's strategy was to systematically get the prices wrong and to systematically twist the prices so that it benefited some sectors rather than other sectors. And that's actually what made it effective. And I just am really inspired by the Korean case, where you take a broadly agricultural country that's undeveloped in 1961, and they're already a world industrial leader 25 years later in a number of critical sectors. And now we are paying a lot of IRA money to those leading firms in order to build out our own clean energy supply chains, right? And the LG in the LG of the battery fame is Lucky Gold Star, which was the chemicals firm that Shaybol set up under the HCI drive in the 1970s, the Heavy Chemicals and Industries drive. in industrial policy. And certainly Korea was not asking any permission or getting any slips from anybody, right? Part of the reason why they were focused on export dollars was not because that's what neoliberal ideology told them to, but because they were trying to make sure that they had independence from the World Bank and the IMF, and they had seen how other countries doing ISI had fallen into balance of payment crisis, and then they lost control of their industrial policy, right? So theirs was a bid for autonomy from the get-go, right? And the fact is that in the 70s, they were motivated highly by the Nixon shock. Remember, North Korea is divided in two by a war, and South Korea is worried about its very existence after the Nixon shock, right? What if this crazy man pulls out the troops from South Korea? We will not exist. China will absorb us into North Korea, right? We will no longer be South Korea. So there's an existential crisis that they are responding to, right? And I think the only reservation that I have in the vision of industrial policy being the answer to what we need on the planet right now is this idea that the countries that have been most successful at industrial policy have done so because of a strong external geopolitical motivation. And we can't manufacture that, right? We can't manufacture the level of commitment that Korea had to its industrial policy. And that's the only thing that I worry about, is how do we ensure that countries have the level of commitment that they have without it sliding back into something like the sorts of nationalisms that we're concerned with here.
Hi, my name is Shag Sengupta. I lead the India program at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I had two lines of questions. One is the role of the MDBs. I know you guys talked about these international institutions giving more fiscal space for developing countries to undertake these green industrial policies, but do you see a role for say the World Bank actually lending out money to do some of this? And how I suspect they're very reticent because it's kind of they're going against 30 years of kind of paradigm shifting of how they go about lending out money and what's the acceptable risk. And then the second line of questioning is on this idea of state capacity that I think one of the speakers talked about. We're seeing this in the United States as well. Like industrial policy is very hard. It takes a lot of coordination, a lot of just blocking or taking down information asymmetries. And so for many developing countries, even the larger ones that have a fair amount of capacity, like where do you see like that capacity increasing in a way that you can get the goals of decarbonization and economic development without kind of retrograding back into kind of protectionism? So India is a very good example of, we're seeing Indian industrial policy kind of taking shape, but I think to some commentators and some analysts, it's saying that the government's just kind of going back to where it was 20, 30 years ago with its protectionism.
Yeah. I mean, I can comment on all that. I mean, thank you for your great brief on the Indian steel deal yesterday. That was a great brief, and I recommend it to everybody to check out Shayak's work on Indian green steel. I mean, I think that with India specifically, I don't see a lot of progressiveness in their industrial policy at the current moment, right? I look at the PLI and I think it's too small and it's too passive for it to really count as a robust industrial strategy that I would actually have faith is going to transform these industries. And they've really struggled to get money out of the door under that initiative. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done within the organs of the Indian state and in Indian civil society in order to build up the capacity necessary to translate the obvious desire to position India in these global value chains into something that looks like a proper strategic gambit to do so. So I think there's lots of work to do, and we would love to collaborate with you on those questions. On regards to where we're going to get the financing from, I certainly think that the World Bank is open to this. I don't know if we'll ever get them to like use the words green industrial policy.
Well, I mean, like hydrogen is a really good example. Like, is hydrogen a great use of public money for development? Maybe not, but
No,
they are at least using it to subsidize some kind of risk. So
yeah, I mean, that's what they've done, right? They basically picked a couple sectors where, and the things that they have picked are things that are kind of predictable in the sense that they're CapEx light relative to the revenue stream. And so the project finance works really easily. But the problem is that not everybody can be a hydrogen exporter, right? And the country that they chose, Chile, was at the top of McKinsey's ranking for the levelized cost of hydrogen, right? And that is because Chile has world-class solar resources in the Atacama. And as soon as you plug that into the project finance, then it comes out that the electrolyzer is going to run at a higher rate than other electrolyzers and therefore pay off the capex more quickly, blah, 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 blah. But the problem is not every country is going to have those economics, right? And not every country is going to have the renewables to spare in order to actually do that. And then we have to compress the hydrogen and put it on a boat and ship it somewhere and then pay the shipping cost. And it turns out that probably electrolyzer cost declines are going to be such that everybody can just produce their own hydrogen locally and the economics won't work for the shipping of it. So what this means, I think, is that institutions like the World Bank can easily get distracted in their support for finance for these projects because they just have limited knowledge of what the transition is actually going to look like. And I really want to second one of Isabel's earlier comments, which is that like we have this narrow definition of green industrial policy. And because of the limited knowledge of the actual content of the supply chains, we tend to get a lot of focus on lithium, which will be the one metal that we have enough of in 2035. And therefore there'll be downward price pressure. And therefore we're going to see a repeat of what we saw with coffee and other commodities in the 1960s, where the bank spread all this money for everybody to develop coffee plantations, and then the coffee prices plummeted, and the International Commodity Agreement, which the developing countries then tried to cobble together to defend those coffee prices, couldn't actually maintain itself. We want to avoid the repeats of those kinds of like neo-colonial enterprises, right? Neo-colonial efforts, especially in the case of lithium and hydrogen, which are likely to have very limited global markets because so many countries could produce those on their own, right? Lithium is widely available by almost everybody, and the technology is getting such that more and more of that lithium is going to be economically available. So there's a lot of danger in the bank, but there's a critical role that they have. But again, I think that the countries need to be in charge of what areas of investment are going to be high priority for the bank. And that means the bank is going to have to be very flexible in terms of how it is going to set the parameters of its lending in these sectors. And that's a critical lesson coming out of the strategic vehicles that have been set up in the global north. So in Canada, where you have the Canada Growth Fund, and in Australia and in the UK now, where you have these like flexible entities that have been made to kind of mimic the flexibility that the sovereign wealth funds in, say, Norway or the Gulf states have happened. The key lesson is they need to have every tool in the toolbox, right? Which means they can write contracts for difference if they need to, or they can take an equity stake if they need to, and these lessons are being applied to the DFC reauthorization here in DC. So like those public vehicles need to have every tool in the toolbox because each of these sectors in the global energy transition are very, very different in terms of their CapEx and OpEx balances and the way that you're actually going to have to structure the deal in order to create demand certainty or supply certainty. So having really bespoke strategies in each of the verticals of the transition is essential. And that's the kind of flexibility that just makes me worry that the bank's role here is going to be kind of limited, because how do you convince them to do this? I mean, they've written these climate strategies for each country, which don't say anything about the economic opportunities of climate. They only talk about decarbonization pathways, right? And it took them 10 years to get to that point. So now we're going to take another 10 years to get them to actually get their heads around what green industrial policy in a strategic vein would look like. And that's why I think it really is going to have to be led by the countries, figuring out what strategies are going to work for them and basically bringing that into their ask in the World Bank portfolio conversations that they're having.
And I'll just add that, going back to Katie's point about the countervailing power question. I mean, a lot of these shifts in the MDBs will depend on how well many actors organize to try to get some of those changes. And some of them are maybe things that look very, very technical and tiny, but actually have a huge impact. Like, for example, I think all the MDBs have kind of like legal frameworks around procurement, for example, that wouldn't allow for having a procurement policy that's used for green industrialization. Because it might cost a little bit more than just like buying the cheapest available product from China or the US or wherever else. Because they're trying to, again, going back to the narratives of industrial policy or the narratives of the analytical frameworks that are being applied here, they're looking at efficiency from this very narrow standpoint of how do I get the lowest cost for like this particular infrastructure project, instead of seeing the opportunities for having a positive macroeconomic impact impact by having a procurement policy that gets transformed into an industrial policy. I think even a tiny thing like changing the procurement rules for infrastructure projects and NDVs could have a huge impact, but it takes effort. And on the broader question about planning, I mean, even in the US, having trouble developing the state capacity that we need to deliver an efficient green industrial policy. And I do think that the question of state capacity, I mean, it's difficult to talk about in the abstract because we have a dearth of state capacity, but there's also often the tendency to build the wrong kind of state capacity. And just to give you an example of how we're not effectively building state capacity right now in the US on the question of solar deployment, we just released a study a couple of weeks ago where we tackled this question of land use planning for solar deployment. And there's this idea that in order to build faster, we have to just bulldoze all the opposition to solar development because people don't want their parks having solar panels built on them. They don't want to cut down forests to build solar arrays on top of them, which is kind of a legitimate concern. But in the study that we did, we found that by doing accounting of all of the low impact, low conflict and high benefit sites around the country, so things like built infrastructure, railways, canals, brownfield, et cetera, we have, I think, something like 200 million acres of low harm, high benefit areas where we could be building solar capacity. And we only need about 5 to 15 million acres. So if we just had a little bit of land use planning, we could very efficiently target all of the places where nobody's going to be unhappy about solar capacity being built, and many people will be very happy because they'll have access to cheap renewable energy. But we haven't managed to do that kind of planning in the US, the richest country in the world. So I think we also just need to have a lot more effort going into like plugging these kinds of critical state capacity gaps everywhere. And maybe we would have that if it weren't for the fact that for the past 30, 40, 50 years, the question of planning has been completely absent from training or any places where people might be able to acquire those capabilities.
Yeah, I have a question. At the beginning, Jeremy, you raised this point, the difference between decarbonization and industrial policy, but I want to throw into the mix development. And to what effect is green industrial policy critical to achieving development, but also will the two be the same project? And then I think from there, second question is, do we have adequate institutions to globally coordinate industrial policy and development, perhaps together, but also separately?
I'll take the second one. No. And actually, it's not clear where we would locate that institution, right? So we have this conversation all the time in the lab, which is like, well, where do we engage? Where can we really actually push this conversation? And I just gave you an argument for why the bank is not a place to have that conversation. Is the G20 the place to have that conversation? It's not really set up to have any kind of sustained conversation, right? It cycles, right? The G7 is certainly not a place to have that conversation. Its interests are too narrowly circumscribed. So there's not a natural home actually in international and multilateral fora in which to actually have this conversation in a serious way. And the fact is that even, because there's no capacity at the state level, there's certainly no capacity at the international level to map these supply chains and understand how they're developing in real time. And I think even if you are like us and you want to be doing that, it takes a really long time to map these supply chains and to really understand how they're developing and figure all this stuff out. So we need something that's purpose-built for that effort. On the question of development, when we think about this a lot, and I think that there was a time in which there were real trade-offs between climate, decarbonization, and development. I don't think we live in that world anymore, actually. I think Jenny Chase, who's the lead solar analyst at BNEF, posted a new report a couple of weeks ago showing, first of all, there was just this puzzling decline in demand on the Pakistani electricity grid. And she's like, I wonder what's going on here. I bet you there's a bunch of off-grid solar going into Pakistan. She checks the export table from China. Sure enough, there it is. And then she's like, where are these panels? And so they contract a satellite imaging firm to look on the flat roofs of every manufacturing facility in the neighborhood of Lahore, and boom, she finds like 300 megawatts, like a crazy number of panels in Pakistan that are pulling demand off of the grid. So, I mean, and this is actually, I was thinking about this in terms of these like unexpected effects of having really strong tariffs on Chinese panels in the United States and Europe, right? Which is actually that the prices are really rapidly declining. And actually you have project dev teams coming out of China going into these neighboring countries to try to find clients. And this is what they're doing, right? They're teaching small and medium-sized manufacturers all throughout South Asia how to install solar panels and to actually get their facilities off the grid. And so it's just an exciting time to watch all of this happening, because what we've been waiting for, which is the reinforcement of decarbonization to actually take over. And what that's going to do is reduce electricity costs in the manufacturing sector all through the developing world. It's going to help actually the development of that manufacturing sector. And we should find every way that we can support it. And it's ironic, actually, I think that the US tariffs are probably supporting rather than hindering that trade. And so that's like one little piece of silver lining, I think, that we can take away from the particular mess that we find ourselves in global decarbonization policy. But yeah, we need to develop those institutions at the global level to actually enable a more robust spreading of clean technology in a way that's not a perverse side effect of what's likely to be seen by history as being a bad policy.
Just on that, so my grandparents live in kind of rural Pakistan and actually recently got solar panels, so they're probably
There
in
you
that.
go. There you go. There you go. It's like everyone's German grandparents, everyone's like Pakistani grandparents are buying solar panels.
I think that was a look. They have crazy sort of load shedding in there, and
Yeah.
they have a farm. They need to be irrigate air conditioned, insane heat waves they have at the moment. So it's like, and it's a cultural. I think almost everyone in the village now has, and it's not recorded. There's no state capacity to record it. But yes, interesting. Just on Melanie's question, I mean, I feel like the kind of obvious answer here would be the UN framework. And yeah, Kim Stanley Robinson in his novel locates this ministry in that context, but I mean it's fiction, right? And I think that we know that it probably wouldn't work. And it's a kind of an interesting parallel of the example I gave in the UK of kind of a climate change committee, which is a very sort of scientifically rigorous, modelling intensive kind of activity, which has no capacity to really think about these hard questions of industrial policy. And I think you probably have a similar thing at international level going on there. And so I think that probably is going to be a difficult game of like demand, just like for these kind of institutions eventually will help them form. And just on the like general question of state capacity in general, like I remain kind of like optimistic on it just as a former civil servant. It's like how exciting and fun some of this work is. And my sense is that it's quite like a universal idea. And I think I do think, you know, if the political demand is there for the long term, I think you can build these things. Obviously, it varies by country, and I think you also have to look at like where capacity in these areas is going at the moment into finance and consulting, and think about how can we repivot some of that, particularly consulting, some of that work into genuine, meaningful capacity.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I work at the Quincy Institute. So I approach this discussion from a little bit of a more of a security perspective. And I want to discuss a little bit more what Ben Lee mentioned a couple comments ago, which is resisting the worst impulses of nationalism. And so when I think about the package of Bidenomics as a whole, breaking through political deadlock here, it's united through a bipartisan hawkishness towards China and increasingly undemocratic national security sort of measures. And so I worry that the principles here that are so necessary for climate and any sort of green industrial policy could be swept away in a sort of undercurrent of nationalism, conflict, and those sort of disastrous things. So my question is, what are the sort of coalition groups here or abroad that we need to strengthen to offer as a sort of counterbalancing internationalism?
I can start. And this also goes back to some questions that we had earlier about the nature of the political coalitions in the US and the role of labor and the question of labor standards, et cetera. One thing that I wanted to respond when you made your comment, Bentley, about the nature of the political coalitions that are emerging around industrial policy is that yes, they're emerging. Yes, you have certain senators who won't vote for an IRA repeal because they're seeing jobs created in their districts, et cetera. That's true, but that doesn't mean that the labor movement itself, that the workers themselves are happy with the nature of those jobs.
Yep.
And that discontent, I think, is also contributing to increasing drift toward this kind of nationalism or authoritarianism or worse, and the appeal of people like Trump. So I think strengthening a coalition that takes labor seriously, that actually listens to those grievances seriously, is probably one of the most important things that we can do to curb the appeal of these kinds of nationalistic narratives. I think that's absolutely crucial in all of this. And not just labor, but I think more broadly, taking seriously concerns about things like inflation, which I've seen a lot of commentary lately, basically trying to commentate away inflation and the fact that working people have really suffered dramatic loss of purchasing power recently, and we have not really come up with serious policies to address that major burden. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how, I mean, that is connected to industrial policy in some ways, because you can get into like mechanisms for price stabilization, things like the buffer stocks proposal that Isabella Weber and others have put forth. And yeah, I think the overall solution here is basically moving toward a set of policy frameworks that include industrial policy, but go beyond industrial policy, and kind of take a cohesive approach to economic management that's taking seriously the grievances of key actors and making sure that we don't have an economy that's making things worse for people and therefore making them vulnerable to nationalistic tendencies. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I'd recommend, there's a great essay in The Phenomenal World by Andrew Elrod on this question, if you've read that. And then Nick Mulder from Cornell had a great essay yesterday in the Yale Review on the same question. And I mean, and both of their theses is that what started out as a broad care coalition, really, in the original Build Back Better Act, in which there was $3 trillion, $2 trillion of which was going to be spent on the care economy, that original vision of Bidenomics has been completely displaced by a more national security-led vision. Both of those essays are unsatisfying in that they don't exactly tell us what the alternative is. For someone that is cheering for American industrial policy, it's difficult to kind of grapple with the situation and be like, well, actually, I don't want the national security apparatus to support industrial policy. Like, of course we do, but they can't drive it, at least not in the long run, especially because the national security apparatus doesn't care about competitiveness, and they don't care about productivity, and they don't care about these things, right? Because that's not the business that they're in. But more importantly, they're not in the business of caring for the people that make up this country and the rest of the people in the world. And so we do have to find a way to like rescue industrial policy from the national security discourse. I don't have any better ideas than Andrew and Nick do. But it's absolutely an imperative. And I do think it was there in the original vision of the Build Back Better Act, right? It was there. And the Build Back Better Act had these two components, right? One was really meant to take care of the services economy, which is where the jobs were, right? And that was supposed to be the political and economic true benefit of Bidenomics, right? Is that we were going to have this broader effect on the whole economy. And a number of critics of the IRA have kind of noted its limited scope. But those critics should also credit the original vision of the Build Back Better Act, right? Which was not quite so limited in scope. But the question of how we preserve political space for that broader vision is a really good one, and one that we need to kind of collectively think about.
Maybe just to add on the national security question, I think it probably can't be removed from the the militaristic state that we have. And I can't remember the exact statistic. The US military are leading emissions provider itself. And my colleague at Commonwealth, Ken Regali, I think actually last week published a really interesting paper looking at kind of industrial repurposing for the UK military state towards essentially green industries, and did a lot of intense kind of interviews with, intensive interviews with workers in these sectors. And it's an interesting read, and talks about the role of like a kind of state holding company to kind of repivot. imagine doing something like that in the US would be more challenging. But I think if it's a national security driven industrial policy, what about an industrial policy driven national security? I think that's one way of looking at it.
Hi, thank you for being here. I am Ichi. I'm currently student at SAIS, and I interned actually at Contemporary Apparatus technology company. It's a battery producer in China. And I think my question is more related to the intersection of private sector and public sector, because I approach environment and climate issue from a public view, but during my internship at a company, it's more like providing me as a private sector view. And I can see that while international system is trying to promote green industrialization and also trying to promote cooperation over carbon reduction, but from a private sector view, companies from China are actually facing more pressure and also more entry barriers or competition barriers. And I think that might be a common problem for different technology companies from China when they try to expand overseas, try to open their markets. And my question is, for scenarios like this, how to reconcile the conflicts between public interest and private interest for individual corporations?
I mean, one thing there, I feel like I was pointing to other Commonwealth work, but I think the corporate governance of these corporations can be crucial. And we have my colleague Eleanor has a project on this. And I think there's like an underrated part of industrial policy. It's just like the governance within firms, level coordination, the incentives they face. And it's not just being about, okay, we need one worker representative on the board. You need to have a fundamental rethink for companies and not in a kind of like CSR, very kind of like generic way, but like a repivot there. I don't know enough or probably have enough answers on that, but I think my sense is that has to be part of it. And I mean, I'd be interested in others on the panel know, but like, is there a significant difference in like corporate governance approaches in green versus non-green sectors? That's an interesting research question. And does that have any meaningful impact on their kind of like investment decisions? I hope it would be yes, but I don't know.
I would just say that the only thought that comes to mind for me is that like discipline is a key aspect of industrial policy and one that we forget, which is that, again, going back to the Korean example, which I know well, these firms were clearly measured, evaluated, and support for them was conditioned on whether or not they were actually performing. And that I think is something that's difficult to achieve. And even China, which we aggrandize China's industrial policy as being far more centralized and organized than it actually is. And the kind of tensions that I think you're pointing out are really interesting. And I would add, and Jeremy's the real expert in the room on this, but the tensions are increased because there are regional interests rather than national interests within China that are aligned with those firms, because many of the regions have their own champions that they would like to push into the national spotlight. And so there are multiple levels of conflicting interests in the Chinese case. And the Chinese government is actually not great at reining firms in once they've gotten ahead of the actual national government's policies. And that's part of the reason why we see overcapacity, right? Which the rest of the world reads as being some nefarious plan, but inside China looks a lot more like the opposite, right? It looks like actually the unplanned nature of this is leading to what the Koreans and the Japanese would have squashed a lot earlier and called it duplicative competition, and they would have squashed it earlier on in the process than Chinese industrial policy is doing. But I think there's a critical set of thinking that needs to be done about how state capacity doesn't just come into the planning function of industrial policy, but comes into the actual implementation of industrial policy, and that the ongoing discipline of firms in a variety of mechanisms, not all of them overt and not all of them above the board, let's say, are going to be a critical piece of making sure that there is public and private alignment in industrial policies over the long run, especially in the case of climate, right? Where you can imagine this going in lots of different directions, right? You can imagine VW putting lots of subsidies in the EV side of its pocket while it continues to fight Brussels on whether or not there's actually going to be a phase out of ICE vehicles from the other side of its pocket, right? So there needs to be ways to actually just settle those kinds of disputes.
I think those types of questions can be particularly difficult in democratic settings, right? So
Yes.
both Korea and Japan didn't have as kind of fierce political competition
That's right.
as like the United States does today in kind of a party that is for or against these types of industries. And so it's just hard for me to imagine that like in 2029, like a new president is going to like shut down a factory in Georgia that is kind of not producing efficiently,
Yeah.
right? That it's hard to think about the installation of this discipline, but I do think this is what we're talking about when we're talking about, well, how can we get industrial policy to actually make things and make things in an efficient fashion if you're not going to rely on on capitalism and kind of like firms going bankrupt because of competition, but you're trying to be efficient with state kind of subsidies of particular firms. Well, then the state has to be willing and able to withdraw those subsidies in some ways. And I think that's like, if we get to that, if that's the political difficulty, then I think we're in a better world than we are today. So
Sure,
I hope that we're in
exactly.
that world,
Exactly.
but that doesn't mean that the politics will be done if we kind of set up the policies that we're talking about today. It just means that the politics will be different going forward. But there'll be more work to do, right?
Put that on any political scientist's tomb, right? That the politics were not done.
And just a quick note on that. I think one thing on the discipline question that's also worth remembering is that it's very difficult to know how to, like, when to crack down or when to hold companies accountable for, or when to evaluate whether or not they've been successful in developing a competitive industry. In the case of the Japanese automotive sector, I think it took something like 30 or 40 years for it to become competitive, and then finally it did. And right now, for example, in the WTO legal framework, countries only have about 8 years during which they're allowed to do infant industry protection to develop new industries. And that's very different from the 30 years that it took Japan many years ago to develop its automotive industry. So I think we also, there's no easy answer to this question, but I think we also have to be somewhat flexible in terms of how to enforce discipline and on what time frame, and be realistic about how those challenges have played out historically and how much harder they may be now when we have much more technological divergence than we had 50, 60 years ago.
I think you could also add on the global coordination front here, right? There may be a firm, right? Like if the Georgian firm in the United States is kind of not particularly competitive because there is a firm in Georgia that is slightly doing the job better, is the United States really going to shut down kind of like this firm for the preference of some other Georgian firm? I think the global coordination is yet another kind of interesting and difficult piece in this like interesting future that we might be building. Other questions?
Yeah, this is like abstract, so I don't know how to phrase it, so my apologies if it's like not as coherent, but I'm kind of curious in terms of the ability to coordinate industrial policy and development. Seems like it's always, development is so prospective. Countries engage in strategies hoping to kind of garner export markets, and even if they're successful, that could be quite fragile just as like new markets and demand emerges. And so in terms of trying to coordinate and plan green industrial policy as like this kind of iterative development process that then increases the income of countries to further and further undertake deep decarbonization. Like, to what extent can we, again, kind of speaking to Adam's point about coordinating across time, like, is there a way to have enough certainty around these industries and like the ability of countries to kind of successfully industrialize in certain sectors, or is that just like very fraught? Even as like a goal?
I imagine such a plan would probably have some countries investing in particular industries that seem to be great for the 2030s, as well as it is subsidizing like the technology development of the industry that will destroy it in the 2040s, right? And how do we kind of navigate those types of domains, right? That we're talking about, like iterative technology gains and so forth. Anyway, solutions.
Well, I think, Bentley, you've written probably the co-authors about this question of certainty and what it leads to in terms of industrial strategies, and there's more like open-ended I think probably you get better on the term than me, kind of like open-ended.
I just remember what I wrote.
I think I read the thing quite recently, but like open-ended set of policies towards like more nascent or uncertain sectors, both technologically uncertain and market uncertain. You lead with more kind of like leaving some of the kind of technology choice questions at the firm level, but with a kind of like structure around, okay, we have an overall policy. That's probably part of it. But I'd also point to just like the state itself having capacity to do some of this stuff probably is quite helpful on the discipline question as well. You know, we've said in the UK, this new publicly owned energy developer, to instill discipline amongst private developers, can say, actually, we will not award you a subsidy contract for absolutely everything. We need that competitive tension in there. But for the stuff that then leaves out to enforce attention, we as the state will just do that activity on a kind of like essentially like purely planned basis, and we will just take the hit on the IRR if you don't do it, but we're not going to just like subsidize you to have an overly generous set of subsidies. So I think actually like there's a kind of sort of a synergy there on kind of public ownership, public-led investment, and actually installing discipline on the private sector, which probably doesn't happen at the moment. If there was a state-led entity that could be in receipt of IRA subsidies, would the subsidies have to be as generous? That's like an interesting question. We've raised that question on renewable subsidies in the UK. So it's just an interesting point. I don't know if that actually speaks to Melanie's question, but I guess the coordination across time becomes easier as you have this like a genuinely green mixed economy, I guess.
Your question, Melanie, reminded me of when I was working in government and industrial policy, all of the different targeting methodologies that we reviewed to try to figure out what our targeting methodology should be. And the targeting methodology that came from the Korean Cooperation Agency had a really interesting time horizon framework where it had different targeting criteria for short-term, medium-term, and long-term time horizons. But there are really like dozens, if not hundreds, of methodologies that try to take into account all kinds of criteria to help countries come up with not a formula, but at least like useful inputs for thinking through the questions of industrial targeting across time. I won't bore you going through them, but there's a lot of fodder out there to address those kinds of questions. But I think when it comes down to it, once policymakers have those kinds of analyses in their hands, a lot of the time, they might spark some ideas, but eventually they just go in a drawer. And then the real process of discovering which industries may or may not be ones that are worth betting on is a process that involves a lot of dialogue with civil society actors, with the private sector, with hopefully not just the private sector, hopefully a broader set of actors. And there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of trial and error, and that's just the nature of industrial policy, and industrial policy that needs to be, that is flexible because it needs to be flexible. I was going to say something else that I forgot, so I'll leave it there. Oh, sorry, I remembered. Okay. Going back to the procurement thing, actually, one of the things that's really interesting about the Ecuadorian experiment with government procurement is that there were a lot of assumptions in these analyses that were done about what kind of productive capabilities Ecuador did and did not have. But in implementing this procurement policy that gave slight preferences across the entire procurement market, it was discovered that a lot of companies had all kinds of productive capabilities that were latent and that nobody had created a market structure to bring to light. So often, like backward-looking analyses just don't really give you a sense of what countries are capable of doing. So yeah, again, trial and error, discovery.
So we're nearing the end. Any final questions?
Two sort of questions. One is, how do you actually draw down and stop a bad industry? So industrial policy is about picking winners and also shutting out losers, and removing stuff from losers or disciplining losers. And they could be losers in the sense of they are become fat and lazy and unproductive. They could be losers in the sense of they are actually bad for green industrial policy. So how does one actually take the bottomless mimosas away? How does one take the carrots away? This question of discipline, I think, is we think a lot in terms of getting the good stuff getting better, but what about genuinely bad industrial policy? And the two examples that I've been thinking about is the SUV boom over the last 20 years was beautifully coordinated global industrial policy. And in the 2008 auto crash, these car manufacturers go bankrupt. The United States rescues them, puts them under government ownership, receivership, and helps them go do your thing. And your thing is make profitable SUVs. So at a moment when you had the maximum leverage over the production function of a company, you let them do whatever the hell they wanted. And the second example I've been thinking about is the EU and diesel. In 1998 or early 2000s, the entire European Commission, stamps diesel as a planet-friendly fuel of the future. And all of, and the European car companies go on this massive investment push into Central and Eastern Europe to build diesel auto manufacturing complexes in Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic. And we're still paying for those consequences 20 years later, where the EU finds it extremely hard to wind down diesel. So they have these, making the kind of wrong decisions has a long shelf life in industrial policy. And we in the United States are going to continue paying for the fracking boom that we kickstarted via government policy from the 1980s, 1990s, mushrooms in the 2000s, and is completely dominating industrial policy discussions in the 2020s. So just a question about how do you discipline the baddies?
I mean, it's hard in a democratic country, as we've talked about. Rwanda just basically ended its textile industrial policy because it concluded that Ethiopia had just entered the market, and they were like, Ethiopia's just set up better logistically. It just will have lower transportation costs. We're inland, they're not. We're going to lose. Let's just cut bait now. And that's a smart thing you can do when you're in a quasi-authoritarian government. In democracies, it's a lot more difficult. I would say my advice would be to develop competition policy of some form that pits the firms against each other or that creates some kind of even playing field. So from the same paper that you're mentioning, Jonas and I talk about how the Chinese government actually used a market-based competition policy that they copied from California in order to discipline and benchmark their EVs against Tesla. And that was one way in which they could winnow this overly large crowd, was by creating a distribution mechanism within the automotive market that allowed for profitable firms and electrifying firms to receive transfers from unprofitable and non-electric vehicle firms. So those kinds of policy designs are the only ones I can think of within a democratic or a free market context, in which you can actually phase out firms is by catalyzing domestic competition and arranging that domestic competition. So otherwise, you really just do have to have this strong state capacity, not only to do the analysis necessary to come to a certain conclusion, but then execute on it.
I don't know. I feel like even in a democratic context, if you design the industrial policy from the get-go to include certain guardrails and conditionalities that say, okay, if you reduce emissions by this amount, then you get to continue. If not, then you lose your subsidy. If you build that in up front, then you are building a legal framework that automatically can discipline some of these baddies. But I think also one of the examples that you gave, like maybe both of them, they're not necessarily about disciplining companies that have been unsuccessful in achieving their objectives. They're about not betting on companies that are pursuing stupid objectives to begin with. And I think that, again, goes back to the original policy design. So it's more a question of like, how do we prevent policymakers from making bad bets in the first place, from pursuing objectives that we don't want, that are not helpful in the first place. And that's, I think, as you know, Tim, fundamentally the question of creating the political coalitions to be able to shape the fundamental policies from the get-go.
Maybe one thing to add is that maybe targeting at the level of the firm isn't always the way to go. Like maybe it's the workers of some of these companies thinking about their future, the customers as well. Some of these companies, and it's relevant in the kind of UK energy context as well. Some of the kind of like fairly useless like energy firms that are kind of slowly going to be either fundamentally changing or going out of business. It's actually been like revolved from out there at the customer level as well. But like conceiving of where the transition is towards, and also just having like basic like social democratic things that people can kind of rely on and stay fast in that sense. But it probably is the hardest aspect of it. And I guess I think about it in the context of like new and emerging technologies. Like I mentioned carbon removal a few times. There were going to be a bunch of like failed GGR companies which had like a lot of backing, state backing, that in 20, 30 years time are always going to be like not the technological solution. And I've not seen any discussions of how do we unwind these like massively subsidized entities. So I think it's a critical question, not just for the kind of like traditional like kind of fossil fuel things, but actually parts of the new economy as well. Don't know. don't know an answer, other than maybe going at a slightly more granular level.
With that, we are at time. I want to thank everyone for coming and for our participants for such great answers to questions and presentations. So thanks.
Probably all just go for a coffee to the cafe downstairs and reassemble at 3:30. Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. Busy week.
Busy week.
How long you been in town for?
I am still
You're
here.
still in town, right? Yeah.
I'm moving is TBD. My, my wife's
Great.
doing
No, it was really great. Yeah, no, it was
moving
really
to
great.
New York right now. Just wanted to come.
I don't think we
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Are you gonna stick around?
Yeah.
Do I have your email?
You guys want to go downstairs?
Or I can give you my new one.
If it's too coherent of a panel.
I gotta get going.
It's a division between you and Bentley a little bit, but
Yeah. Thanks for having. And
I'm Noah Gordon from Carnegie. Yet, but
Oh, yeah. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I watched the beginning online.
Wow.
You have it's on your file.
You had a